Well, good afternoon, everybody. As usual, I'm unscripted, but I'm going to make a few comments, and I will also provide a few ideas, as it were, for these things to sort of anyone who wants to throw the ideas about and get them looked at and take on board some of the things that I've got to talk about. I welcome it very much. So we'll get straight into the problems in New South Wales at the moment. There's 4 XPT motor cars that haul those trailers. Of course, the XPT as a train that need their pin replaced between the bogie and the carriage. I don't want to get, there's nothing technical about this, it's just that they've got these faults. They've been around for 30 odd years, but it's irrelevant in a sense. They should be repaired and looked after properly, which they're not. And only just now withdrawing them. But what they've been doing is putting on buses. Now, not just rail enthusiasts, but the general public would prefer to ride a train for 12 hours than a bus for about equal amount of time, say from Sydney up to Grafton. So the first thing that needs to be done is that these carriages need to be locomotive hauled, and you get some double-ended locomotives to haul them, and as you go to casino and have plenty of time to run round and put the locomotive on the other end and haul the train back to Sydney. That is the only train that I'm aware of there's a problem. But the other train, incidentally, actually is the daylight or the midday train up to Grafton, I understand, is a problem as well. So replacing that with a bus, and that's the train, just as I say, midday around 11:41, and then gets up there late at night and leaves again at 5 o'clock or so in the morning and comes back to Sydney. Once again, that's a bus, and when you think about it, the Pacific Highway is not that good. I mean, it's got a lot of duplicated over fairly long stretches, but people just do not want to sit on a bus for many hours and have to just buy their meal, like let's say halfway, and continue sitting in cramped conditions of a bus. So I would suggest locomotive hauling those carriages with a locomotive that has head-end power. Now, that's not necessarily easy, but they can do it. And one class of locomotive that has the head-end power, and I know this sounds a bit expensive, but hire a couple of CLP class locomotives, and if necessary, do what they do in some places, in particular in the United States and I guess Canada and Britain to a degree, is to have a locomotive at each end of the set, and then you don't have to worry about turning it. So that can be done. Now, they're ordering XPT replacement cars, and they'll be just simply diesel model units. The problem with that is that people have got the engine noise. It might not be over intrusive, but it'll enter the cabin, or you can feel the vibration of the engines under the floor compared to the XPT, which has a power car at each end of the set. So that's not good. And it's been strongly rumoured that these cars are going to be like you get in Europe and in Britain. And straight away people will say, well, what's wrong with that? Well, the problem is half the seats would face forward and the other half of the seats basically would face backwards. Now, on suburban services in major cities, let's say Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and so on, Adelaide, people don't mind. People don't mind getting on a train to a certain degree for half an hour or maybe an hour and sitting backwards. I personally would rather find a seat facing forward, whether it's a window seat or an aisle seat, but I do attempt to get a forward-facing seat. Anyway, this is what's rumoured, and I don't think people would be too happy with that. So that's been talked about, but what is not even considered, not even entering their minds, is the potential for a major war to break out shortly, or I can't put a date on it. I can't say 3 months, I can't say 6 months. Could even be quicker. With what's going on over in the Middle East at the moment, in particular with this situation where half the oil was destroyed, the storage in Saudi Arabia, and it was the rebels in Yemen took the blame, but that was just a deliberate tactic in my opinion, and of course it was actually the Iranians that did it. So I'm not getting onto the politics of all this right now. I'm just explaining that if a war does happen and it spreads and it basically becomes a world war, then all these orders that are in there for South Korea and so on to get these trains, or Spain in this case, the XPT replacement coming from Spain, these things may never happen. You might think, oh, that's silly, don't worry about it, of course it's going to be okay. Well, I can tell you now, I'm just saying it today, as I said, the 19th of September 2019, I'm making a statement now. If it comes to pass, then that's fine. You can see that that's what I've said. Now, getting on to more, shall we say, nuts and bolts in the sense of what could be done. Let us assume that the XPTs are running again in a few months' time. It would be quite logical for the Midday XPT not to operate. I'll explain why and how it all works out in a moment. The morning train goes to Casino and comes back overnight. That would remain in service. A train to Brisbane should leave around 6:30 p.m. and that's been talked about, and have it arrive in Brisbane at 8:30 a.m, leave at 9:30 a.m. and get back at about 11:30 p.m. in Sydney, which is fairly late. And of course some people might choose to have a stopover. I would, for example, stop over at somewhere like Taree or perhaps Dungog or Maitland. But in any case, that's only a matter of personal choice. But that's what could be done. Now, how to operate the midday train is this. Put an XPT set on a day return from Sydney up to Tamworth, and have a 3-car Explorer train running from every day in each direction. In other words, an afternoon service going to Moree and a morning service coming out of Moree for Sydney. Now, when the train into Tamworth would be a bus connection all the way to Tenterfield. Now, some people might object to that and they want the Armidale train, but there's no other freight trains. There's only one train a day over that line, so it's hard to imagine why they continue operating it in that sense. Now, if those Explorer cars were suddenly available, there'd have to be 10 of those or more. You could have a 3-car set operating in each direction, in other words, on that midday to Grafton, if that was felt to be necessary. And certainly you could have a couple of cars based in Griffith to do 3 days a week to Junee with Melbourne, a Melbourne connection on the XPT, and 3 days a week down through Yenda and Barallan and Temora down to Cootamundra with a Sydney connection, offering, in other words, a 6 days a week service could be provided. Also, there could be the Broken Hill service could be more frequent, and there's more that could be done with this, so that there's a better utilisation of rolling stock is quite possible, but they don't seem to be overly interested in this. and they're making some adjustments right now, and I do applaud one of them, and that is the well, actually the provision of an extra Griffith train, but as I said, that could be 6 days a week instead of twice. And the Broken Hill service is good. And if a second set, in other words, could provide 3 days a week to Broken Hill and 3 days a week to Griffiths as well, if they wish. But the thing I'm about to applaud, in other words, is the second train from Bathurst to Sydney. It's a very, very welcome development. And as is, in a sense, for the time being, that afternoon service to Griffith once a week, and there's a morning service once a week, so it gives you a bit of flexibility there. Anyway, there's a lot more that could be said, and I don't mind people putting comments and suggestions and ideas and tossing about some of these things. And I'd like to see groups such as Action for Public Transport and the Eco Transit group in Sydney look at these things, and the Rail Back on Track in Brisbane also to have a look at it. So thanks for viewing.